Friends, we're going to get started in just a few minutes with our International Rabbinic Schmooze, so please take some time, get whatever provisions you need from the back of the room, fill up your coffee again, and find a nice, comfortable place to sit. Wonderful to have all of you joining us this morning for what's going to be more of a casual kind of conversation in place of what we do typically as our regular Torah study. But chaval, God forbid, any time that we as Jews gather, we shouldn't have words of Torah on our lips. And so we'll start with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We have the privilege this week of not only having some wonderful friends of mine, distinguished guests from around the Jewish world, Rabbi Levi Wyman-Kelman and Rabbi Adi Cohen, but also that we get to start a new book of Torah together this week, the book of Bamidbar in the wilderness, and so welcome to the wilderness that is Buffalo here. I was going to make some kind of joke about Jews wandering and finding this place, and there's a fantastic book that really is one of the first to document the history of Jews in Buffalo by Selig Elderman, the book Ararat to Suburbia. Of course, Ararat, the mountain that Noah's Ark landed on at the end of 40 years of just floating around the ocean, and maybe a rainbow would come out at the end, but we've got rain this morning, so I don't know how much it feels like Ararat this morning. Not yet. But there is this sense that we as Jews, we do wander. We do find ourselves as outsiders often in different areas of the world. And I think just to give a little bit of perspective here as we start our conversation with those that have joined us this morning, we really represent three different communities in three different places in the world with rich Jewish communities, but different ones. So, speaking about Queensland, Australia, we can start there and recognize that in Queensland, Australia, you perhaps, Adi, are in a place serving a Jewish community where Jews are a minority of the country of Australia, and to be at a progressive, a reform Jewish congregation, you are a minority among the minority. You, Levi, being in Israel, in Jerusalem, you have served a congregation for many, many years, and now as emeritus, but a congregation where Jews are the majority in the country, but Reform Jews are the minority of the Jews there. And here in Buffalo, of course, Jews are a minority of the country, but we as Reform Jews, we actually represent a majority of the affiliated Jewish world. So to start with, give us a little bit of perspective about what Yiddishkeit is like in your different areas of the globe here. Pass that.
So first of all, Shabbat Shalom. And I think that one of the challenges and the opportunities that I'm dealing with in Queensland is that there is no concept of Yiddishkeit. There is no Jewish day school, there's no Jewish community center. I can't even advertise to the Jewish population in the Gold Coast because I don't know where they are or how to reach them. So while it sounds like a challenge, and it is a big challenge, it's also an opportunity, and I'm now in the process of working with my board and with several major Jewish donors to actually open a Jewish community center adjacent to the congregation. And while I am the minority who's actually in touch with and work with the environment. So the only rabbi that you will find in parliament events, the only rabbi that you will find in interfaith events, and that puts me in a very unique place that while I'm part of the minority, the religious minority, I'm the one who is out there. I'm the voice of Judaism in the wider community, representing Judaism to the police, to politicians, to other faiths. They don't know any other form of Judaism beside what I give them. So that's the reality. We have 5 Chabad rabbis who are constantly fighting with each other when I'm not interested in their quarrels. So I get to do the job, the work. So it is a challenge. We don't have any Yiddishkeit. And on the other hand, I have the opportunity to bring this Yiddishkeit to Queensland and to be the center of Jewish life.
Can you tell us a little bit more, Adi, about how Jews got to Queensland generally? I mean, there's this idea, wherever you go, there's always someone Jewish. We even had a song about it, right? It seems as though what you're telling us is that there are Jews there. It's a matter of finding them. Give us a sense, what does the average Jew look like when you do find them?
So there are three types of Jews in the Gold Coast. The minority of the minority, about 5% of them are second or third generation in the Gold Coast. Very, very rare. There's a joke in Australia that grandparents and grandchildren in the Jewish faith will never be buried in the same cemetery. It's a sad joke, but that's the reality. Kids leave the city where they grew up and they move somewhere else. So we've got a minority, a very small minority of people who are second and third generation. Then my congregation was established by retirees who retired from Melbourne and Sydney and came to the Gold Coast as a retirement place. It's a tourist destination. It's the best location to live when it comes to the climate. And my congregation was established as a Jewish retirement club. Later on, it became a synagogue. And these are the people who are still feeding the congregation, people who retire from their work in Melbourne and Sydney, move to the Gold Coast, looking for a place to daven on the high holidays, get hooked in, and become members. The third type of membership or Jews that we find in the Gold Coast only started about 6 to 12 months ago, and these are the youngsters who work from home that were in lockdown for 2 years in Melbourne and Sydney. They had enough from the big city. They work from home anyhow, and now they're moving to the Gold Coast for quality of life, entertainment, good times, and they are a bit more challenging to bring into the congregation. They're in earlier stages of their career, but we have quite a nice group of 20 to 30-year-olds that are starting to form as I would say, a tribe within the congregation. But that's the demographic, and these are the Jews that you will find in the Gold Coast, the traditional families, the retirees, and the, I would say, millennials that are moving to the Gold Coast now.
So, being a Reform rabbi in Jerusalem is hard to compare to other things. The reality of Israeli life. I always like to. A few people came up to me last night and said, "You know, when I came to your congregation, I was so confused because everything was in Hebrew." Now, it's an Israeli congregation, and we're all Hebrew speakers. When Reform Judaism was formed at the end of the 18th century, one of the central ideas was that you pray in the language of the general community. So in Germany, where Reform was born, the service was mostly in German with a little Hebrew. In England, and then eventually the United States, mostly in English with a little Hebrew. In Israel, the general language, the lingua franca, is Hebrew. So I say that in one act, we are simultaneously the most radically Reform, because we do everything in the language of the community. But we are also very traditional compared to other Reform communities, because everything is in Hebrew. So we can use the traditional prayer book more or less. So I think that's just an example of one of the challenges of, and one of the major differences of an Israeli congregation. We live in Yiddishkeit, right? Jerusalem, everything is drenched in Judaism. Even the most secular Israeli, the holidays that we celebrate are the Jewish holidays, and those are dictated mostly by nature. Everybody around Passover time, no matter what their religious affiliation, has an urge to clean, because it's time for spring cleaning. And so all the chametz comes out, and when it comes time for autumn and people start building their sukkot, it's in autumn, everybody's getting ready for the winter. It's like the last big blowout before the rainy season, and things kind of everybody kind of hunkers down. So the natural rhythm of life in Israel follows the Jewish holidays. So when I think of the challenges of rabbis in the diaspora to pull Jews in, to get them tuned in to the Jewish holiday cycle, to give them a reason to feel connected to the Jewish community, those things are pretty irrelevant in Israel. In Israel, all the Jews feel like they're living in one giant Jewish community. So you don't need a Hebrew school. Your kids learn Hebrew just from waking up in the morning and talking to their parents and going to school. You don't need a Jewish youth group to find Jewish mates for your children, because everybody who your kids are hanging out with, they're all Jewish. The structure of Israeli society is that, because I won't go into all the historical reasons, but the Israeli government provides religious services. And by that I mean, when you want to get married, you go to a government office to start the process of getting married. These are, of course, only controlled by Orthodox rabbis. But to be recognized as a married couple in Israel, you have to, if you're Jewish, you go to an Orthodox rabbi, and provided by the state. So you don't need to join a synagogue if you want to have a rabbi marry you. When it comes time to be buried, the cemetery is also provided by the government. You don't need to belong to a synagogue if you want to have a Jewish burial. So if you think of all the reasons why people join synagogues in the diaspora, none of those are really relevant for Jews in Israel. So why do we need synagogues? Well, we need places to pray, and we believe firmly in the importance of prayer, but also we believe in the idea of intimate community. And Israeli life is very communally oriented, very family oriented, and people, go through kindergarten all the way through the army together and feel very connected. So the idea of having a community is part of the Jewish consciousness, especially if you think of kibbutzim with such a strong emphasis on communal life. But Reform community is something that's very, very difficult for many Israelis to grasp. The dominant form of Judaism in Israel is Orthodox Judaism. The models that Israelis see of religious leadership are Orthodox rabbis. And in that way, one of the starkest differences between Israeli life, Jewish Israeli life and diaspora Israeli life is, I would say, one of the main, well, I don't want to speak for diaspora rabbis, but in my sense, growing up in the diaspora, that your job is to pull Jews, somehow find ways to attract them, to find Judaism attractive. Well, nobody has to be convinced to be Jewish if they're a Jew in Israel. That's not the synagogue's role. My job and my congregation's job is to instill values, and the values that we cherish, the dedication to the tradition, the egalitarianism, and being an open, welcoming community, those are things that are not necessarily taken for granted by most Israelis. I spend most of my time trying to convince people that Judaism is about human values, about human rights. And often the counter-argument is that Judaism doesn't believe that because the spokespeople for Judaism are mostly right-wing nationalist rabbis who have a very different take. So in that way, it's a very, very different reality. When I'll just give you one statistic that I think says it all. In the nursery school in my congregation, there was not one kid who comes from a family without two Jewish parents. Not one. So issues of dealing with intermarriage and assimilation, those are not issues that are part of the Israeli landscape. But because of the Orthodox domination of the religious scene, there is a great distaste on behalf of most secular Israelis of Judaism, because the Judaism they see turns them off. And therefore our role is to present a Judaism that they can relate to, that is connected with modern life and values that they can relate to. So I think that's a very different reality than other places.
It's interesting for me in listening to both of your responses and hearing the different ways that we count and note the progress that we make against our goals of building our communities wherever they are. And it occurs to me that one of the focuses of this week's portion as we begin is that Moses is ordered to take a census of all of the Israelites. He counts all of the Israelites from all of the tribes first, those that are of military age. He counts all of the Levim, all of the priests, all of those that are part of this division that serve in the temple. It compares very strongly, I suppose, with another census that's taken by King David in the book of Samuel, one where King David comes up with the idea of doing the census. It's not ordained, and the result is that there is this calamity, there is this curse that befalls. And so I think it speaks to something very internal about us as Jews. We're sometimes afraid to take censuses. We're afraid to count. We don't like to have to identify how many of us there are, and sometimes we don't even know how to count or what to count. And so I'm wondering in this moment, and maybe I'll hand the microphone back to you first, Levi. I think the number that I heard last night, the year I heard, 1985, was that the year of Kol HaNeshama's inception? And through the course of the last nearly 40 years, how have you seen Reform, progressive Israeli Judaism change? Is there is there a difference in the way that it's been received by the average Israeli from the time that you founded your congregation to the present moment? Where are we headed?
So it really is striking when I think back to when I founded the congregation in 1985, and when I would mention being a Reform rabbi or Reform congregation, the blank stares that I got from most Israelis. Clearly, the idea of a woman rabbi was something that was inconceivable in Israeli society. And in the general debate in Israeli society, the debate was between the Orthodox and the secular. And there wasn't anything in between. There wasn't any non-Orthodox religious voice. A number of things changed that landscape dramatically. So first of all was the Aliyah from America and English-speaking countries, which brought Reform Jews, not in huge numbers, but enough to set up congregations, and we became more and more of a presence. Kol Neshama is in a very central location in Jerusalem, and we're very much a part of the Jerusalem landscape, and I would even say the national landscape. I think another interesting change is that Israel went from being a very insular society to much more global and connected to the world. I think of two dramatic things that happened. One is it became very, very commonplace for Israelis kids when they finished the army to travel. And after a year of travel, they would come back having been exposed to the world out there, and that had a dramatic effect on Israeli society, especially when the most popular travel destination became India. And then you had thousands and thousands of Israeli kids post-army spending time in India, including Orthodox kids, being exposed to a whole other kind of spirituality, who came home and they said, wow, why can't we have a religious life here that has real.
Guess who was a counselor in a nifty summer camp?
Okay, so that's a perfect example. These Israeli Reform movement started bringing Israelis, secular Israelis, to camps, into the Reform camp system, where they got turned on to a different kind of way of being Jewish. So that kind of made the ground very fertile for the growth of the Reform movement. Another example that seems very kind of prosaic, and now it sounds old-fashioned, was when cable TV came to Israel. Before there was cable TV, there was one Israeli television station, and every Israeli, every night, watched the same news broadcast, the same sitcom, and the same, show like Dallas or Dynasty, one of those kind of shows. And then I remember when my kids were little and cable TV came, it just suddenly, Israel saw itself as part of the world. And when my sister was ordained as the first woman rabbi in Israel, she was the first woman to be ordained in Israel. Yay. She's about to retire now as the dean of the Hebrew Union College campus in Jerusalem. But when she was ordained, two stories that I think are indicative of a lot of things. One is that we watched there was a news report on CNN interviewing her. And we watched this news report, and the phone started ringing as people were waking up all over the world and watching CNN. People would call us excited to see my sister on television. And you could feel the earth turning as people were waking up and realizing that there's a global event going on. The other thing I like to remember is that when she was ordained, she turned to the Israeli Academy for the Hebrew language and said, I'm about to be ordained. We need a word in Hebrew for a woman rabbi. And the official answer she got back was, there is no need for a word for a woman rabbi because they don't really exist. Now, that reality has changed dramatically. And women Reform rabbis serve all over Israel. And on Israeli soap operas, there's often Israeli Reform rabbi characters, or people going to Reform synagogues. And now it would be virtually impossible to have a conversation about religious life in Israel without there being also an acknowledgement of the non-Orthodox denominations. So that's a huge change. So where I would say that our numbers aren't huge, the awareness of us is. And in that way, we punch way above our weight in terms of having an influence.
So is there a word for women rabbis?
So most women rabbis call themselves rabbah. In my sister's generation, they stuck with Rav. She was Rav like rabbi in the male gender. But most women rabbis now call themselves rabbah. So as opposed to Rebbitzin, the first attempt was to call women rabbis Rebbitzin, which is, of course, the rabbi's wife. And Israel had to be educated that a Rebbitzin is not a female rabbi. I remember when they interviewed my brother-in-law, and they asked him, what should a rabbi's husband be called? So he was a lieutenant in the Israeli Air Force. So he said Rav Seren, which is the Israeli Hebrew for lieutenant. But his other official answer is lucky.
So talking about the census, I think that there are two different dimensions that I would like to relate to. One is who makes the census, and the other one is who wants to participate in it. And that's what I define to myself, that I'm dealing with the business of belonging, with the people who wants to be part of the census, and they're dealing with a longing for belonging. And I think that one of the biggest questions that we ask ourselves each and every generation is, who are we counting in this census? 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, patrilineal descent was not part of our discussion. Today, patrilineal descent are about 50% of my congregation. If we're talking about conversions in the past, today we're talking about growing numbers of affirmations. People who are Jewish descent, sometimes halachically from the mother's side, but they didn't grow up as Jews because their parents rejected religion all in all. And now they want to come home. So I think that we need to be sensitive when we're talking about census and who do we count, that circumstances changes. One of the phenomena that I've noticed happening in the last 3 to 5 years is that we have a lot of LGBTQA plus members of the community that are coming to our synagogues, whether if they want to convert or not, it doesn't matter. But when I started talking and having the discussions with them, we are the only religious denomination in the Gold Coast or in Perth who actually accepted people from this community. So we were their only spiritual safe haven to spend or experience spirituality with, regardless of their background. And I see those numbers growing more and more and more, and I'm saying to myself, I may be the doorkeeper, but I'm also the welcoming committee. And I need to find a balance when I make the census to ask myself, am I sanctifying heaven's name by opening the doors of spirituality, of Judaism, of Jewish ethics, of Jewish tradition to people who are longing for it? Or am I being the gatekeeper to keep the boundaries of my tribe where They are. And we know that the boundaries keeps on changing every generation. But to what extent do I make my current membership uncomfortable with the changes that I allow? And to what extent do I keep the warm, fuzzy feeling in the congregation as your spiritual home? You're looking for the familiarity, you're looking for the ritual, for what you know and comfortable with. So the whole concept of census, I think, is about making constant changes, constant growth, constant wondering, not just as a rabbi, but with my congregation, about the question, not just the question who we are, but what do we stand for. If you want to be counted in our census, what are the requirements for you to be counted, and what are you willing to do in order to be part of us? I don't expect you to sit on the pews. I expect you to be a proactive member of the congregation from day one. Even if you just started the introduction to Judaism and you're not even in the conversion path, you're not a spectator. What are you willing to do to be proactive about being a member of this community, this congregation, in order to be included? It's not the half shekel, the 5 cents or the 10 cents or the dime that you gave in order to be counted. It's the effort that you put in to be part of something that is bigger than yourself.
It's a very interesting point. Where do we draw our boundaries, and how do we limit our community, and how does that affect who gets included? You know, this whole dilemma of the disappearing Jew. There was a popular article going back in the middle of the 20th century saying essentially that by the time that those who were active in Jewish communities at that stage were having grandchildren, there would be no Jews left. This was from a diaspora perspective, of course, but it really does raise another question of who is our Torah for? I've heard one of the co-founders, co-directors of Klal, Bradley Artsenschweit, rabbi, asked this question: who is your Torah for? Looking for us as rabbis to reconsider how we demarcate the boundaries of our communities and how we both do that role of wanting to draw in more people to our community so that we can fulfill our mission while at the same time setting expectations of those that are here. I want to change topics a little bit and ask what has become a very significant question in recent years, I think especially with the way that national politics in the United States and elsewhere have gone. I want to bring up the topic of anti-Semitism. We here at Temple Beth Zion, we now regularly employ, as those who came this morning saw, security guards. We have regular coordinated meetings with our partners throughout the community, other congregations, but also all of the increasing levels of people willing to take violent measures to pursue their goals, their aims. What wisdom can you offer us as we think about this ballooning problem of anti-Semitism, one that literally, the ADL here, the Anti-Defamation League in the United States, which tracks these hate crimes, has seen an increase 3 out of the last 4 years, including the largest ever increase, 36%, just between the years 2021 to 2022.
So my childhood friend is Deborah Lipstadt, who we grew up just a few blocks away from each other on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and she's now the ambassador for the United States to combat anti-Semitism all over the world. I haven't seen her yet on this trip, but I'll see her in a bit, so that I would have a better answer after I speak to her. But for those of us who watch what's going on in the Jewish world outside of Israel, it's of course very disturbing how over the past years, things that would have been unthinkable have become mainstreamed by both right and left. I think that's one of the great challenges here, that you have such virulent anti-Semitism from the white supremacists, and how easily anti-Zionist rhetoric becomes anti-Semitic rhetoric. Now, as you probably got the idea last night, I have no problem being critical of my government, and criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism, but when Israel is scapegoated and anti-Semitism can easily become anti-Zionism can become anti-Semitism. So these are just incredibly troubling trends. And here I have to say that what's going on in Israel doesn't give me a lot of comfort right now, because some of the worst anti-Semitic stereotypes are in some ways being played out by the more extreme elements in the Israeli government who used to be on the margins of Israeli society with terrible anti-Muslim and anti-Arab racism, has now become more mainstream in Israel, and the increased power of the ultra-Orthodox and ultra-nationalist elements in Israel in some ways play into the worst anti-Semitic stereotypes that are out there. So whereas Israel was founded to be a solution to anti-Semitism, to be a haven for Jews all over the world where they could feel safe, and to present a more normal Jew who was a country just like every other country. And it has turned out to be much, much more complicated than that. And there is no simple solution to the reality of anti-Semitism. And it's just still, for me, inconceivable that things that were unheard of are now part of the mainstream of the political discourse here in the United States, and I find it so deeply upsetting.
I think that we first need to change the paradigm. And the paradigm around the world is that Jews are victims, and you can victimize Jews. One of the reasons that in almost every big function that I have in the congregation, I have the chief of the counterterrorism attending the event, and sometimes the chief of the police, is because I made it very clear to them that their approach to anti-Semitism or any hate crime is to diffuse the situation. And they know that my approach is very different. I grew up in Israel in the IDF, where you engage as fast as possible. And I was very clear. I told them, if someone will slap me on my face, I will not turn the other cheek. I will break their arm and call the ambulance. Sorry, guys, that's the reality. They know that I will not diffuse the situation. I am not a victim anymore. That's done. We pay the price for being victims. So first of all, I think that we need to stand tall and to say we are part of the society in which we are living in. And you are not less American because you're Jewish, and you're not less Israeli because you're Jewish, and I'm not less Australian because I'm a Jew. So first of all, let's change the paradigm. We're not victims. The other thing that I think that we need to do is to start building friendship and alliances. There's a phrase in Australia, when you want to brush someone off, you say, that sounds like a you problem. It sounds like a you problem. Your problem, not my problem. Only last Yom HaShoah, there were swastikas and pamphlets around my synagogue. I interviewed to the local media. My face, God forbid, was on the front cover of the newspaper, and my board were freaking out. Now they see your face, they know how you look like. Yes, they do. So what? My face is on the website as well. But the thing was that when I interviewed to the media, I didn't respond to the anti-Semitism against the Jews. I responded to the hate crimes against minorities in Australia. And I was very clear that I don't care if I'm Jewish and that's a synagogue, or if you're Chinese and that's your place of worship, or if you're a Muslim and that's your mosque. Hate crimes should not take place in Australia, period. A month later, there was a hate crime against the Muslim community. The first phone call to the imam was from me to support and to say, what can we do to make things better for your congregants? And I'm sure that when things like that will happen, and they will happen again, building coalitions between religious leaderships, between groups, not just faith groups, in the wider community, and sending the constant message that hate crime is not a me problem or a you problem, but it's our problem as a society, is probably the best way to attack this situation. There are no easy solutions, I agree with you on that, but I think that we need to start changing the paradigm. We are not victims as Jews, and we can't see hate crime only as our problem when we need to face it. Hate crime is a hate crime. If someone here in Buffalo was attacked because of the color of their skin in the shooting a year ago, that's my problem. That's your problem. It's not their problem. And the more we engage, the more we will show compassion to each other, and the more we will show that we are part of the same community practicing different faith or different approach to life, we will be there for each other. And I think that that's the way to deal with anti-Semitism, to say, it's not me who's not legitimate here. It's you that the whole society don't want you to be part of, the perpetrator, not the victim.
So I have one more question for you, but I'm going to save it for before we end potentially, and ask if there's any questions from the audience here. I see a hand there. Any others around here? So you can continue to think about what you might want to ask if there's some more, but please, Judy. So the question was about George Soros, prominent Jewish Democrat, funder of a lot of politicians and their campaigns, who's become his name a sort of anti-Semitic trope used by those wanting to raise conspiratorial theories about Jewish influence. Essentially, the same old fable about the protocols of the elders of Zion buried in there somewhere. Judy, was it a specific question for one of the rabbis up here?
Yes. What is your recommendation? I know you said that we're not victims anymore, but what would be our comment to our neighbors, or how do we respond?
You only start to attack someone or be against a person when they are successful, when they possess a threat. And my question in response would be, why do you think all this hate, where did all this hate started from? Is it because he is an accomplished politician, or is it because he is Jewish, or is it because he is a Jewish accomplished politician or businessman? Doesn't matter. But you don't see those waves of hate against people who are doing nothing or against people who are not successful. And it happened that he is a successful Jewish businessman. I think that using the Jewish element is just a way to say, he's doing well, I'm not. Okay? I don't think that, and I think that it started, traditional anti-Semitism started when Jews were deprived of owning land. So they had to deal with Luftgeschäft, to trust their brains and their mental abilities to generate capital to feed their families, or to become bankers, or to become lawyers, or to become doctors, anything that have to do with your abilities and not with your possessions. And guess what? A few years later, a wave of anti-Semitism. The Jews are ruling the world. Now, I've got to tell you something. I'm a Jewish rabbi. I'm a Freemason. I've been to the Grand Installation in Israel. Jewish Freemasons cannot put together a single dinner, let alone to rule the world. But to be serious about it, I think that I will confront them with this question. Where is it coming from? Because he is Jewish, because he is successful, or the answer is yes, because of both. And what does it say about you? It's a very simple answer. And I think that as Jews, that's our Jewish way to answer with a question and to confront them with their stupidity. Are you jealous? Are you less successful than him, so you're trying to diminish him? Where is it coming from? Have these conversations. Don't be afraid to put things on the table. Yes, he's Jewish, he's successful, so what?
Yeah, I think we just have to be vigilant. The exact rhetoric that's used about George Soros is the exact rhetoric that was just substitute the name Rothschild. It's word for word. These conspiratorial theories about the Jewish people are completely unacceptable, and we just have to call it out whenever we hear it. And I agree that we have to form alliances, because it's not just our problem. We have to really expect other leaders to join us in calling these things out. And to join them when they're attacked, of course.
Looking for other questions that might be out there. Sure, Vicky.
I was very touched last night, Rabbi Levi, about everything you said about Jerusalem. And I want to say, as the daughter of a German Jew who was there, at that time, in the inception of Israel, that Jerusalem, especially the Temple Mount and that surrounding area, that has had so much reason to remind us of what all of our faiths tell us to do, and then yet the Israeli soldiers coming into the mosque, to Al-Aqsa mosque. Where do you see a path? Is there anything from here that we can do? If you would just speak a little more to that.
So Vicky Ross is asking a question based off of your comments last night about Jerusalem Day and these religious Zionist right-wing folk, young Israelis, some older, that are provoking and antagonizing and entering spaces that are other faiths, sacred spaces, and your perspective on that.
Yeah, here I think, well, in general, with the whole political situation in the Middle East, I have to say that I am a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. Not because of anything rational, except for the pessimist part, but if I wasn't hopeful for the long term, I don't think I could get out of bed in the morning. I don't think I could continue my work. So I have a deep conviction that Jews and Arabs can and must learn to live together and figure out a way to share, especially the trickiest part of the whole equation, the Holy Basin, where all three religions really put their focus. And here, here I have to ask for American Jewish help when Israel misbehaves, when the Israeli government encourages behavior that we would not find acceptable if was going on here. It is not acceptable to just say we can't criticize, we can't say anything, because indifference is the big sin. Indifference to the suffering of others is inexcusable, and we certainly are upset when non-Jews are indifferent to Jewish suffering, but that means we cannot be indifferent to the suffering of non-Jews. And I think people from outside Israel can play a real role in encouraging dialogue and getting both sides to listen to each other and to, if not come up with a long-term solution, at least pragmatic steps on how we can learn to live together. And I believe that's possible.
So that hopefulness is really important, and I want to take a second to come back to an incident, event in this region's Jewish history that I mentioned at the start. This idea by Emanuel Noah of founding this Jewish utopian community called Ararat, and in many ways, I think that those Jews who came in particular not only to this region of our country, but to the United States in general, that they were looking for opportunities and security and hope that wasn't present in other ways. We are here at Temple Beth Zion, part of this remarkable community, 173, soon to be 174 years old as a congregation, with many important moments in the history of this congregation, but one that stands out, and I think all of us are reminded of regularly when we come to this campus and we see the sanctuary that's constructed just over there, is that there was an intention of bringing Judaism, not only that, but this specific brand of Reform Judaism, into the civic social dialogue of this city. That building was created as a monument that, to put it bluntly, cannot be ignored. On the most prominent street in the city, built in a prominent way that distinguishes it from everything all around it, as a way to say that there are Jews here in Buffalo, and Jews here in Buffalo, we are here to be part of this culture, part of this community, and to try to guide it with all of those moral and ethical underpinnings that are so powerful within our flavor of Judaism, towards a more constructive, healthier place. And in a way, I think we as Jews should be proud of the role that we've played, particularly in the United States. I'm thinking of the American movie industry and Hollywood, and this idea of a Hollywood ending that resolves in a way that all of the dreams of the protagonist come true, right? They've got that happy ending. And we have this tradition in Judaism, too, of a nechemta, that we always try to conclude our reading of the Torah in a place that gives comfort, that gives hope. And so my question from the different places that you sit around the globe in the Reformed Jewish space, what gives you hope for the future?
I think that as a child, my favorite Shabbat ritual was to watch Bonanza on Friday afternoon with my dad. Dum, dig, dum, dig, dum, dig, dum, dig, dum, dum. You know what I'm talking about, right? And it always ends, each and every episode ends with them riding into the sunset. And that's my hope, that them riding into the sunset doesn't mean that they reach their destination, that it means that they keep on riding. Now, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, said, "Ma she'aya hu she'yeh, akol hevel avalim." What was, will be, it's all nonsense. And I hear in each and every congregation that I visit the same challenges, the same problems in different magnitudes. I hear it for the past 30 years. And it gives me hope that we are not on our way to a certain destination. Judaism is a journey. My grandparents complained that the grandchildren are the worst and will be the worst Jews in the world. Do you remember what they said about Elvis? And then what they said about the Beatles? And then what they said about Miley Cyrus? But only in one it was your grandparents' generation, then it was your parents' generation, and then it's you kvetching about your children's generation. So I'm full of hope that in 20 years' time, Judaism will be nothing that I want it to be. But there will be Judaism. And just like you are 10 years younger than me and full of energy, and I'm a bit more cranky by now, you bring something new to your congregation, and I bring something new to my congregation, but we are both no longer the cool 20-year-old camp counselors. Okay, you're still cool, but what I'm saying is that I know that the Judaism that I bring to my congregation today is probably not what my kids and the 20-year-olds in the congregation are looking for. But I'm hopeful that they will eventually have their own leadership. They will have their own rabbis, dor dor vedorshav, dor dor meforshav. Each generation and its commentators, each generation and its judges. So I'm hopeful. I know that we are dealing with the same challenges. I know that we are all dealing with declining membership and with the question, how do we bring more people to the service? And how do we bring young families? I actually think that it's wrong to put so much effort in bringing young families. I would like to bring more grandparents to the congregation so that the grandparents will bring their grandchildren to services. The grandparents have the time, have the capital, and have the urge to be part of the community. I want them to bring their grandchildren, not the parents who are not coming to bring their kids. Sorry, guys, let's be honest about it. So I'm hopeful, but I know that the future that I hope for is going to be very frustrating for me, because it's going to be the young people who are going to rebel against what I represent today, the same way that I rebel against the Judaism of my grandparents a few years ago. So that's my nechamta. I know that someone will eventually make me uncomfortable and angry.
Are you hopeful about your frustrations too?
So I want to tell you a story. So you heard last night that my mother's father was Rabbi Felix Levy, who was the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel from 1904 to 1954. 50 years in the same congregation. Like, I did close to 40 at Kol Neshama. That's pretty good, but he did 50. He was an unusual rabbi in many ways, not the least that he was a passionate Zionist at a time when the Reform movement was rather hostile to Zionism. Not just the Reform movement, but most Jews except for ardent Zionists. My grandfather was a passionate Zionist and came to Palestine on numerous visits in the 20s and 30s. And he was very outspoken in his Zionism. And in the late 1800s, at a conference, Reform conference in Pittsburgh, the infamous Pittsburgh platform was passed by the Reform rabbis, of clearly an anti-Zionist platform, that Buffalo is our Jerusalem, Cincinnati is our Jerusalem, Berlin is our Jerusalem, any place but Jerusalem is our Jerusalem. In 1937, the Organization of Reform Rabbis, the CCAR, got together again for their annual conference, and in Columbus, Ohio, and a platform was proposed that was pro-Zionist, that said, we recognize in Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people, and it came for a vote, and unbelievably, it was a tie vote. This was in 1937. My grandfather had just been elected president of the CCAR, so it fell upon him to cast the deciding vote. And as a passionate Zionist, he voted in favor of the Columbus Platform, which really began the reform movement toward the movement that it is today that embraces Israel and Zionism. I often fantasize. 1937, think what was going on in the world in 1937, and especially in the Jewish world. I imagine someone going over to my grandfather, right after that vote, and saying, do you know what, Rabbi Levy? In 2023, you're going to have 2 grandchildren who are rabbis in Jerusalem, the capital of the state of Israel. Well, I don't think he would have been able to get past that sentence. You know, Israel as a state, Jerusalem as its capital. One's going to be your grandson, who's going to be the rabbi of one of the largest congregations in the country. And the other is going to be your granddaughter, who's going to be the first woman ever ordained in Israel. And her daughter is going to be a rabbi also, and is going to serve a congregation in northern Israel. And your 6 great-grandchildren in Israel are going to have studied in a school that your grandson and your granddaughter created in the spirit of the Reform movement. I imagine someone telling that to my grandfather in 1937, and my grandfather going, what drugs are you on? That is completely inconceivable. Absolutely inconceivable. And yet what I just described was the driest possible description of reality. So in my darkest days, I imagine that there's someone who could come to me and describe a future to me that is well beyond anything I can imagine. And I'm sure that that's the case, and that whatever it's going to be in 70, 80 years is going to be just amazing and magnificent. And I won't be around for it, but I'm glad my wonderful grandchildren will be.
You can give another round of applause for these amazing rabbis. Yeah. Thank you both for this really meaningful conversation that raises both these challenges that we've faced for generations, as well as new circumstances that have changed in our world. And surely it gives me a bit of chizuk, a bit of strength, knowing that there are colleagues like you all around our world that are seeking to inspire and seeking to uplift and seeking to lead us towards a more hopeful place. And at the same time that we can celebrate what we have accomplished and what we have achieved. And just personally, from my perspective, on behalf of the congregation, you coming here to celebrate my installation this weekend is truly something of so much joy and specialness. I don't have words to adequately describe it. Thank you. I'm going to make a quick public service announcement to say, mostly to those who are streaming this Rabbinic Schmooze online, you need to hit the back button on your browser and find the correct streaming link for the sanctuary. If you find on tbz.org Shabbat services right towards the top, there will be a link there to our sanctuary stream. We'll be resuming there with Shacharit in about 6 minutes. We'll see if we can make that happen. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you for joining us.